in America today. So, like many of us, I've been thinking a lot about the state of our republic and about American democracy since the 2020 election. I was stunned, again like many of us, in the aftermath of that election about how close we came to a genuine constitutional crisis in this country. Also, as a scholar and teacher of both election law and constitutional law, I became very painfully aware of just how much we have collectively forgotten about the way our Constitution structures our choices about how democracy in America works and what it means for us in this country to be a self-governing democratic republic. So since January 6th, Americans that I've talked to and I think across the country have just bristled with questions about how our elections are even supposed to work. What is the Electoral College supposed to be doing? What's the role of Congress in that process? What's the relative power of state, local, federal officials, courts, all of the players in this? A lot of these things were issues that most Americans didn't really have reason to think about before. But suddenly they were urgently and critically important. And there weren't a lot of good answers that were readily available to people to look at and think through those issues. So I began working on a project that I hope can help refresh our collective recollection about how the choices that our founders made, or in some cases failed to make, continue to shape the debates that we have today about what self-government looks like in America. Now, our founding documents were not perfect, and their authors knew they weren't perfect, but nations need stories. And what our documents give us is a variety of narrative threads that we can pull and weave together to construct a story that we collectively can think about in thinking of how to structure and organize our system of government. So our Constitution is old now, and there's a lot of these different threads that we could choose from, choose which ones to pull and focus on. But the one that I've been thinking about, and the one that I'm going to tug on today, has been remarkably consistent throughout our history. We are, and we have always been, a nation committed to representative self-government, operationalized through formal institutions. So our founders' solutions to their fears of tyranny, oppression, and demagogues were institutional ones. And my message to you today is that our solutions have to be as well, for the simple reason that there is no other way for we the people collectively to live together and peacefully share political power in the face of deep and sometimes often good faith disagreement. So this focus on institutions, and specifically the institutions of representative democracy, is in an intentional contrast to the story of rebellion. The tendency today, too often, is to disparage our institutions and to narrate the history of our founding mainly through the prism of rebellion, not representation. We romanticize the rebel and we forget the representative. There are reasons for this, of course. Americans love an underdog. And to narrate the history of our founding, mainly as this story of the scrappy colonists grabbing their guns and overthrowing an empire, there's a lot about that that's endearing to the American psyche. And on the representation side of my thesis here, there are obvious problems. The idea of who the people entitled to engage in representative self-government in 1776 was very tragically limited. It would not have included many, if not most of us in this room today. So when you're looking for a narrative, a thread to pull that we can collectively gather around, the idea of representativeness has some obvious problems. But, and this is my point, despite their cramped view of who the people entitled to self-government were, our founders were unequivocal in their commitment to grounding their actions, even and most especially their revolution, not in their own personal preferences, but in the expressed desires of the people acting the only way a dispersed group of individuals can, through formal representative institutions. In other words, our founders weren't cowboys. They were not vigilantes claiming for themselves the right to decide the fate of the nation. They were quite literally representatives, chosen by and accountable to their understanding of the people, acting through their representative institutions. Before we even became a country, the mechanisms, the machinery of those institutions kicked in, and our representatives debated, deliberated, and ultimately decided what the colonists collectively would do. That commitment to the institutions of representative government is the legacy of 1776. It is the premise of the 1787 Constitution, and it's the promise of the Constitution today. So we all know the story of the rebels. The story I want to share, the thread I want to tug, is the story of those representatives. So the importance in our nation of operationalizing self-government through representative institutions was there from the very beginning, in the words of our first founding document, the Declaration of Independence. Today, the words that most Americans recall or remember from the Declaration are in its second paragraph, which proclaims that all men are created equal. But in 1776, the Declaration was first and foremost exactly what it declared itself to be. It was an announcement, a declaration by the free men of the 13 British colonies that they had and were asserting the right to govern themselves as a free nation. So the immediate importance of the Declaration was not its assertion that all men are created equal. That wouldn't even begin to be realized for 100 years in another war. But the immediate importance was in its claim that people are entitled to establish their own government rather than be ruled by kings. That concept of the sovereignty of the people, the right to collectively govern yourselves, it's the central argument of the Declaration. Governments are instituted by men to protect their rights, and when a government becomes destructive of those rights, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it, which is what the colonists did. But they did it by debating, deliberating, and winning their independence together. So those words of the Declaration, they were powerful in 1776, and they remain powerful today. They've inspired important movements both here and abroad. But they've also become a rallying cry for fringe groups in American society who want to claim the mantle of 1776 while agitating to overthrow the government of the nation that those words created. Those self-appointed patriots, though, misunderstand the movement they purport to emulate. The men who wrote the Declaration were not rebels acting outside of official structures. They were literally delegates chosen by elected representatives to gather and debate how the colonists collectively should respond to the actions of the British. So revolutions are unequivocally violent events. But America's decision to declare independence and separate from Britain was debated, negotiated, and ultimately made, not by the mob, but by men acting together through formal and organized structures. So, let me elaborate on that. For decades, colonial leaders in British America had enjoyed at least a modicum of self-government. Before 1776, each of the original British colonies was governed by a combination of an executive appointed by the Crown and an assembly elected by the free men of the colonies. And men of means in the colonies had been electing representatives to those bodies for more than 100 years. They were structured differently in different colonies, and they had different powers in different colonies. But it often required their permission before rules governing the colonies could go into effect. And colonists also had power locally that they could exercise through local common law courts and town governing bodies that managed much of the day-to-day life that affected people. So by 1776, British Americans had become pretty accustomed to having a say in how they were governed. Colonial leaders believed, they saw this as their right. They thought they were as entitled to this as were their counterparts across the ocean in England. So they were unhappy when the British began retrenching on those arrangements. Now, the Declaration of Independence is pretty well known at this point to sometimes subvert historical accuracy to rhetorical flourish. But the list of particulars that it includes against the king vividly captures the intensity of this objection. The Declaration's list of specific accusations against the king are just filled with different iterations of concern that he has disempowered their representative institutions and deprived them of the permission and power necessary to govern themselves. So, deprived of those basic privileges of self-government, the freemen of the colonies revolted. But they didn't do it lightly, and they didn't do it on their own. Instead, men across the colonies did what a self-governing people do. They acted through their elected representatives who gathered and debated the best path forward. So in pre-revolutionary America, what this looked like, what it meant, was that colonial assemblies authorized delegates to meet and discuss what they should do. 12 of the colonial assemblies agreed to send representatives to Philadelphia to meet in what became the First Continental Congress. Those men, those delegates, were closely bound by the colonial assemblies that sent them. Some of them were actually literally bound by instructions that they couldn't act without the permission specifically of their assemblies on particular issues. But even those who weren't bound that way, they weren't freelancers. They were representatives of the institutions that sent them, and they knew that the only authority that they had was drawn from those entities. They had authority because of their role as delegates sent by representatives. So collective bodies like that tend to move slowly. It's one of the things that frustrates people about them. And in accord with that, our march toward independence was also slow and deliberate. Many of the delegates at that First Continental Congress personally favored independence, but they weren't authorized by the assemblies that sent them to take that move. So instead of just doing it on their own, they settled for much, much less. They petitioned Britain to change course and to restore their privileges of self-government. They sent a petition. And then they went home. And they waited for the king to respond. When he did, and they didn't like his response, the colonial assemblies met again, collectively, and sent delegates to a follow-up Second Continental Congress, convened in 1775. That Second Continental Congress also acted with considerable constraint. The only recommendation it made that year, it advised the colonial assemblies to prepare for independence by setting up institutions that would become the state governments. So the reason for all this caution was simple. The delegates to these congresses may themselves have favored independence, but the people that had sent them simply were not there yet. So they waited. It was only in the following year, when British remained obstinate and the conflict intensified, that support among the colonists finally shifted more decisively toward independence. And yet, even then, the delegates at the Continental Congress, they still waited until that shift in sentiment took a more official form, which it did. In the early months of 1776, citizens across the colonies met. They met in town halls, they met in assemblies, they sent petitions to their colonial assemblies, and those colonial assemblies debated and voted on what the path forward was. Only then, when they had in hand the permission from the colonial assemblies, did the delegates to the Second Continental Congress do what they had probably personally been wanting to do for a while. They issued the Declaration of Independence. And in doing so, they were crystal clear about their role. The Declaration identifies them as the representatives of the people, acting not just in their name, but with their authority. Now, concepts like the people and sovereignty and authority, these are always probably inevitably abstractions. In all but the tiniest of nations, the people are not one thing, and their sovereign authority is exercised indirectly and imperfectly. But representative government can nonetheless be tethered more or less to the people in meaningful ways. It is demagogues and dictators, not democratic Republicans, who claim to act in the names of the people while refusing to hear or heed the choices of the representatives chosen by the people. Our founders were neither of those things, which is why they literally sat in Philadelphia and waited. They may have known that independence was where the nation was headed, and most of them certainly wanted to nudge things that way. But they also understood that to act without the authorization of the colonial assemblies would have been to betray what they said they were fighting for, which was the power of the people to govern themselves, acting the only way they collectively can through established institutions of representative self-government. So over the course of our history, the importance attached to operationalizing the sovereignty of the people through these types of institutions has been respected over and over again. Colonial assemblies were elected by the free men of the colonies. Representatives to the continental congresses were selected by those assemblies. The decision to declare independence was debated and voted on by the Continental Congress. Even after independence, when the former colonies operationalized their new state constitutions, those constitutions were ratified by delegates, elected by people to participate in specially called conventions. And of course, the 1787 Constitution would be ratified the same way, by delegates elected by people at special conventions specifically called for those purposes. So the beating heart of early America was this faith in the ability and the right of Americans to govern themselves that way. So this commitment to representative self-government, it didn't end with the Revolutionary War, but it did take a new shape. Because despite the aspirational words of the Declaration of Independence, the actual people living in the colonies in the 1780s were not really one people in any meaningful sense of the term. They spoke dozens of languages, they hailed from different regions, they practiced different religions, and they enjoyed very, very different privileges and burdens. So how those people, the people who would become Americans, would collectively govern themselves, it wasn't obvious. And their first effort to do so, through the Articles of Confederation, didn't really work out at all. The government created by the Articles, which really was a confederation of states, it lasted less than a decade. And the failure of that system made it abundantly clear to virtually everyone that a new system was needed. One with a stronger central government and a government with a direct electoral connection to the people of the nation, which the Articles didn't have. So just like happened in the lead up to the Revolutionary War, the state legislatures once again sent delegates to Philadelphia to deliberate about what to do. Those delegates met in 1787 in what we now, of course, know as the Constitutional Convention. Their work, the Constitution of 1787, is yet another place where I think we sometimes lose the thread of representation when we are narrating our own story. In this particular case, I think, we become so fixated on the 1787 founders' fear of unconstrained majority rule that we sometimes forget that their solution to that perceived problem was not to reject the right of the people to govern themselves through representative institutions, but once again, rather, to channel self-government through those institutions, which would themselves all be directly or indirectly accountable to the people. So questions of how to do that was at the heart of the project undertaken by the 55 men who attended the Constitutional Convention that summer. It was clear that the new government had to have more power, and that a more powerful central government would only be seen as legitimate if it had some direct relationship to the people it governed. Now, the founders understood this perfectly well. It's why they wrote their Constitution, so it would be ratified by the people acting through these special conventions rather than the existing state legislatures. It's also why they created a central government that was more closely tied to the people than that which it replaced. This is something I think we also forget. But the 1787 Constitution created a significantly more democratic national government than that had existed under the Articles of Confederation. The 1787 Constitution created for the very first time a federal government in which the people of the nation were themselves directly represented in the House of Representatives, the People's House. It was that increase in the power of the people that the 1787 founders both facilitated and feared. They wanted and needed a central government that would more directly represent the people, but they also feared the unconstrained power of the people. So their goal was to create a system of government that both respected and channeled that power. Today, the channeling part of that statement sometimes manifests as a debate about whether the government that they created is a democracy or a republic. Participants in this debate seem to think that something really crucial is at stake, that we have to choose between being a democracy and being a republic. But that's not how the 1787 founders thought about what they were doing. In early America, the meaning of both democracy and republic was very much in flux. Some members of the founding generation associated democracy with unconstrained majority rule and insisted correctly that we were not a democracy in that sense. Others used the term democracy to describe what we today would call pure or direct democracy, where all eligible citizens assemble and vote directly on the laws that will govern the nation. We're also obviously not that. But many others use the terms democracy and republican interchangeably to define systems like ours in which the governing authority is derived from the people rather than a monarch. In a republic, in this usage, the people would rule instead of a king, but they could do so directly in assemblies or indirectly through elected representatives. A republic, in other words, could be deeply and meaningfully democratic because the sovereignty of the people could be manifested through elected representatives serving in formal institutions. Now, I confess, it's not entirely obvious to me what's supposed to be at stake in this debate about whether we're a democracy or a republic. We are both and more. But it seems, at least at times, that some advocates on the republic side of the debate want to leverage the founders' fears of unconstrained majority rule to argue against the very idea of majority rule itself by diminishing the power of the representatives and institutions actually chosen by the people. Like the false patriots claiming the mantle of 1776 while ignoring the role that representative institutions played in authorizing our revolution, this misperceives the choices of the 1787 founders. James Madison and his friends might have feared pure democracy or unconstrained majority rule, but their solution wasn't to disavow representation or even majoritarian government, but to operationalize it once again and even more completely through formal institutions. So Madison famously explains this in the Federalist Papers. In Federalist 10, he talks about it in terms of how to control factions, and in Federalist 51, he talks about it in the context of separation of powers. So both of these essays are illustrative here. In Fed 10, Madison talks about how the new Constitution will control factions, which he defines as a number of citizens amounting to either a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united against rights of others or against the aggregate interests of the community. So as his own definition makes clear, a faction to Madison can constitute either a majority or a minority of citizens. But Madison's not worried about minority factions, because in a Republican system of government, numeric minorities will be outvoted. He's crystal clear on this point. He says, if a faction consists of less than a majority, relief is supplied by the Republican principle, which enables the majority to defeat its sinister views by regular vote. So numeric minorities, in other words, they can slow things down, they can clog the administration or convulse the system, as he puts it, but in a Republican form of government, they don't rule. Even Madison's concern about majority factions wasn't about majoritarianism per se, but rather only how majority factions, only those groups acting contrary to the public interest, can be controlled. Now, that definition of faction is obviously slippery. Determining what is and is not in the public interest is precisely what people turn to democratic institutions to mediate. But the key point for our purposes is that the 1787 founders' solution to this perceived problem was not to empower minority rule, but rather to channel majority rule through a complex set of competing institutions, each of which themselves would be directly or indirectly accountable to the people. So the new Constitution, Madison tells us in Fed 10, would do this because in a large republic like the United States, elected representatives are going to be accountable to more and more varied voices, which is going to make it more difficult for those malignant majority factions to form. He made a very similar argument in Fed 10 about the separation of powers. There, what he tells us is that the separation of powers is also going to both empower and channel the will of the people, this time by slicing and dicing the electorate into these shifting groups to ensure that different representatives sitting in different institutions are accountable to different voters at different times. That system, like the larger republic, will again control factions not by giving governing power to minorities, but by distributing the power of the majority in these various ways. So none of this is about disempowering our representative institutions or rejecting the right of the people to govern themselves through those institutions. Instead, it was the institutions themselves that would provide any necessary constraints. All of which demonstrates the importance the 1787 founders put on using representative institutions to safeguard against the risks they saw in self-government. These ideas about growing the electorate and providing for the separation of powers and checks and balances were core to the design of the 1787 Constitution. The 1787 Constitution relies on this dynamic repeatedly. The House of Representatives and now the Senate are directly elected by the people, but neither can enact legislation without the other. The president can veto legislation passed by Congress, but Congress can override that veto. The justices of the Supreme Court determine the meaning of the Constitution, but they can't take their seats until nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. They also, like the president, can be impeached and removed by Congress and are subject to other types of congressional regulation. So the institutions our founders designed to do this relied on this system of not disempowering majorities, but by distributing the power of the people through these institutions. Now, the institutions they designed to do this were obviously far from perfect. It required a civil war, the Reconstruction Amendments, decades of activism, and then even more amendments to nudge them even a little bit closer to delivering on many of their promises. The institutions also don't always function the way their designers foresaw. House districts are much larger than the founders likely expected. The Senate is much more non-majoritarian, and the Supreme Court is much more active. And the Electoral College, that never worked the way they intended it to. They almost immediately had to just redo that, and it still wasn't awesome. But what these institutions do, despite all of this, in a way that I think we do lose sight of sometimes, is that our institutions have actually kind of worked. They have constrained the use of demagogical power, which I would propose is exactly why they are under attack today. So we sometimes hear that the challenges, the attacks that our democratic republic is facing in this moment in time are the inevitable consequence of the emergence of a truly multiracial, multi-ethnic representative democracy. That may be true, I don't know. But our founders foresaw a vision even of this, not, of course, in terms of racial, ethnic, or gender diversity. That vision of America was not something they had the imagination or wisdom to foresee. But they did know that the nation that they were creating was composed of people with what they saw as very different interests, values, and priorities. And they actually celebrated that. In Federalist 10, Madison tells us that the new government set up by the 1787 Constitution would succeed precisely because of what he saw as the diversity of interests presented in a large republic with multiple and competing levels of government. The heterogeneity of American society, albeit in 1787 terms, was to Madison a virtue. It was the expansive and diverse nature of the republic, he said, that would work to protect the liberty of all. The language that he uses to describe this is, to me, striking. He talks about how by creating a society broken into many parts, interests, and classes of citizens, the rights of all would be protected through the formal institutions of representative government set up by the new Constitution. To be clear, celebrating the institutionalization of political conflict this way does not mean we have to accept our institutions the way they are. The 1787 founders knew that they were not infallible, and we shouldn't treat them as such. They knew and expected that future generations would add their own gloss to their handiwork. And generations of Americans have done that. We have changed our Constitution. It's hard. Constitutional change is hard. And it's playing a very long game. But the Constitution has been altered to make it more representative, more inclusive, and more fair. That's a path we too can take. More immediately, though, many of the things that ail American politics today don't actually require constitutional amendments to change. Opinions on the best solutions will vary, of course, but there are many things that we could, through ordinary legislation, do to try to enhance our democratic republic, not by rejecting our institutions, but by improving them. So extreme gerrymandering can be curtailed at the state level through legislatures or independent districting commissions, or at the federal level through congressional legislation. The ability of Congress to govern could be facilitated by filibuster reform in the Senate. Submerged political minorities could be given a voice in Congress by increasing the size of the House. We could abolish single-member congressional districts. It's just a statute that does that. And encourage states to do things like allocate their congressional caucus through a system of proportionate representation rather than through individual districting. We could encourage states to do different types of voting procedures, like instant runoff voting, instead of our current system, which is predominantly composed of first-past-the-post plurality winners. We could even, through ordinary legislation, make the District of Columbia a state and finally give our fellow Americans living there voting representation in Congress. Changes like these could stymie the growth of majority rule, they could increase voter satisfaction with our political system, and they could help more people feel more connected to our system of representative democracy, all while working within our institutional structures. This type of collective action through our representative bodies, it's the common thread running through our history, and it is our best path forward. The men who wrote the Declaration of Independence in the 1787 Constitution had a tragically limited notion of who the people were. But they did not waver in their understanding that power flowed from them, from the actual people exercising power the only way a group of people can, through formal institutions populated by elected officials accountable to the political community through regular elections. That understanding that in a self-governing society, our disputes are best resolved through the institutionalization of political conflict, it's the promise that our founders made to the future. Today's pretend patriots who claim to act in the name of the people while rejecting the choices of the actual people are not the heirs of 1776. They are its antithesis. Thank you. And I believe that I'm in charge of asking for questions.
So thank you for,
So thank you for coming. It was a fascinating lecture. So one of the things that's always interested me is how the founders seemed, at one hand, to admire many aspects of the British system when they developed our institutions, and yet at the same time seemed to have a somewhat labored understanding of them. An example I would give is giving the president an actual veto when the veto power had long since faded in the old country. But in a wider question, I'm wondering if you think that any of the critiques that were levied over a century ago by figures like Walter Bagehot and future President Woodrow Wilson about how parliamentary democracies are more fluid, more responsive, more able to change. So I'm wondering if at this point in the democratic experiment in the West, you see any continuing unique value of our presidential system as opposed to the Westminster system that's developed out of the mother country, or even some of the consensus models that have developed out of the continent?
That's a great question. And parliamentary democracy has exactly the advantages that you've listed. It can move swiftly, right? Because if you win a majority of elected office, you actually have power and can use it. And that has many advantages in terms of efficiency of government. It also has what is, to me, I think, an important advantage. It makes choices clear for voters, right? It's very clear you elect a platform more than an individual. And then you decide however many years later that you actually think that this platform has succeeded or not. So it brings clarity to voting and actual power to governing majorities. And there's a lot to like about that. And I'm not sure that if we were to design our Constitution all over again, that we would not bring more of a system to that. But I've spent a lot of time in England and have friends there. They don't love their government right now either. And what they're concerned about, they really see this as a form of tyranny. Because they see their majority, the government in power, as having unchecked power, particularly in the British system, which has a weaker form of judicial review than ours does. So I think it's kind of pick your poison. to some extent, and the 1787 founders certainly chose a radically divided system of powers, right? We're divided horizontally and vertically, and you have to have majorities of majorities across various systems to actually do anything. And that can be very frustrating. It also is a pretty effective check, for better or worse. So I think there are pros and cons to each.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was wondering, in the course you're talking about representation and how this can sometimes function in the American system. And it seems to me like one of the changes that we've seen in recent time is that increasingly Americans understand the president rather than like a local representative as really their true representative in a certain, whatever sense that means. And so, insofar as people understand that as representation, don't some of these intermediary Republican type of institutions end up actually blocking the representation that many, I mean, rightly or wrongly, how they conceive of representation functioning, where they block actually a president from being able to do all the things that they want a president to do?
Yes, in the blocking, certainly, obviously. And I think the perception of the president as being the most important player in American politics is partially a consequence of the malfunction of Congress. Congress, as Congress becomes less and less able to act effectively, the office of the president becomes more powerful almost by default. Because in government there are certain things that just have to be done, and the president has to be the one to do them. Now, whether or not people see the president as opposed to other entities, they certainly see the president as the main leader, but whether that translates into seeing him as the true representative, I think that's more complicated. I think that is going to shift a lot given the partisan dynamic in play between Congress and the president and the voter that you're talking about. So I'm not sure that I would agree with that premise that people see that as the most representative national figure as opposed to simply the most relevant national figure.
Hi, thank you again for coming to speak. I really appreciated this sort of reframe from like the rebel to representative. I'm wondering if in your scholarship in this area, if you've had any sort of engagement from folks who have sort of idolized that rebel, maybe people who supported the insurrection in any way, and if you've had any sort of thoughtful engagement from that, and if people have responded to this one way or the other.
I don't think Twitter counts as thoughtful engagement. So I think the short and immediate answer is no. I do think what you have, I think that the more thoughtful kind of debate around the events of January 6th is not really defensive and on its own terms, but bickering about what it was. And you know, there are serious thinking out there that debates. You see this. I engage with this most frequently in the debates about disqualification under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. You know, was this really that? I think that's where you see the serious engagement about those issues.
Hi, so when we think about the sort of changes you talked about that, you know, we can make or push for to, you know, advance like democracy or proper representation, how do we, for lack of a better word, incentivize some of that, especially when we think about like redistricting reform, when oftentimes it might run directly contrary to, at the very least, the perceived interests of the people that are representing us, like the politicians that would have to be advancing that sort of legislation.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not a fast process, and this gets back kind of to the first question. Simply winning elections in the short term isn't enough to bring about structural change in our system. And so you really do have to play the long game. And I think your example about gerrymandering, you know, the litigation at the Supreme Court failed in Ruscio, so we don't have a constitutional rule prohibiting partisan gerrymandering, but that itself triggered action in states, right? So I think it's just a matter of reminding ourselves repeatedly that big changes don't happen quickly. Right, the trajectory of institutional change has always been painfully slow. So it's just kind of staying with it. You know, and I know people your age kind of glare at people my age when I say, you know, vote. The vote harder phenomena is something that's been tossed at me once or twice. But there is power in grabbing a moral high ground by continuing to show up and continuing to show. I'm from Wisconsin, and Wisconsin is one of the most gerrymandered states in the nation right now. In order to actually win that case in the field of public opinion that can eventually pressure for change, the voters need to keep showing up and keep demonstrating that their assembly does not actually represent the majority of citizens in the state. And so voting harder actually does matter.
Speaking of a moral high ground, I'm a newly elected member of the Illinois Appellate Court.
Congratulations.
You ought to see the detail in the for the conflict of interest statement that I have to complete every year and file with the state. Do you think there's any hope that we will see something similar to that from the United States Supreme Court, so that the people can have confidence in our United States Supreme Court again?
Yes, I do. I think that I really believe that will happen. I think the court is just waiting for like a whole week without a scandal, so it can put that out there without appearing to be immediately responsive to some sort of news item.
Right here.
Oh, okay.
I got it.
Hello. Okay. So I guess my question is, in modern times you see a lot of criticism about the Supreme Court, and you also, there's obviously a lot of questions relating to presidential power and the scope of it. And I feel like Congress almost dodges a lot of the fire in this regard. So I guess my question is, in some ways, do you agree in the sense that, like, do you think major congressional reforms could, I guess, fix people's problems or qualms with the other branches? Or do you think maybe each branch needs to be ideally relooked at?
Yeah, I think Congress, the structure of Congress is the easiest, relatively speaking, to change through ordinary legislation. So that's why most of my kind of wish list focuses on Congress. I'm on the record, I think 18-year Supreme Court terms would be a really, really important move to I think that it would kind of keep the benefits of longer terms and get rid of some of the disadvantages, including some of the malfunctions in the confirmation process. So I think that you start with Congress, and then hopefully the court and the president they're just heavier lifts, frankly, in terms of getting things done without amending the Constitution.
You have a question here. Yeah, just pass it down.
Hi, thanks for coming. I've been thinking a lot lately about agnotology, which is the study of culturally influenced doubt. And it seems to me...
Sorry, culturally influenced what?
Doubt. So it seems to me that, just as a 1L, that the legal system can be very arcane and inaccessible.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering like what we can do as lawyers and law students to bring more awareness and maybe help in a practical manner to maybe effectuate more institutional trust, so that when we do have a transfer of power, people know what is and is not permissible.
Yeah, so I think this is something a lot of lawyers are focusing, quite honestly. I was talking to your dean about it before the talk, and this notion that law schools and lawyers generally, we've become fairly inward-facing. and doing more outward-facing outreach is, I think, really important. It actually was the impetus for the project that I'm currently working on, which I teach an undergraduate class in democracy and the Constitution in addition to my law classes. And it's really been an experience in understanding both how that there's a real hunger and eagerness for a better understanding about just how even things are supposed to work, not a polemic about what they should be, but even what they are. And I think we as a profession can do much more to kind of reach out to the public where they are and try to bring that broader awareness. There was a question back there somewhere.
Can we get one more question?
So just in addition, to amplify what you just said, and also to amplify your comment about vote harder, I would add, don't just vote, but also volunteer to be an election worker. Because right now, here in this county, our clerk is desperately seeking election judges. And that's something concrete that you can do, even as a student, to help people to gain confidence in our system, is to be there and let people see the kind of people who are on the ground running our local elections. And our elections are run locally, so be there, show up. It's not just a problem for somebody else.
I can't top that. I will just endorse it. Thank you.
We would like to give you a gift as an expression of our gratitude in traveling all this way for this informative and engaging lecture. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for attending, both in person and virtually. For those of us who are in person, please join us for a reception that we're going to hold in the pavilion. Thanks everybody for your attendance.
They were actually 53 minutes. We gotta get there first. I did not. I'm trying to focus.
I actually have it written up. It's I'll do some. Thank you so much. As I'm sure you know.
That's your natural state.
To do that thing.
You know, it's funny. I was going to ask. What is our
No, it's this front. It's this front.
I mean, it's, I'm so proud of it.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I've always taught it.
You may have to put them back down when you get it in place, though. Yeah, that's
Especially because I get all my sister graduated.
That's right. They're going for politics.
But it's really
So I ended up taking my LSAT last summer, and it went okay, but I'm thinking about retaking it. But I'm planning on working, taking a gap year. So I've got a job like a
that's rewarding. And apparently you whispered the right things.
I think I had seen that she undergrad. Did she do undergrad? I thought she did law school. I don't know. Yeah, I saw that in her bio. I was like, oh, that's so funny. I wonder if she's from Wisconsin.
We were talking because she, you know, she was asking about a shuttle building. once we do this drive, you're gonna understand. She goes, oh, I do this drive.
Yeah.
She said, we drive up. All of her family is still in Wisconsin.
Aww.
And she said, we do this drive. Usually Champaign is a gas stop for us.
So funny.
And so I'm like, wow, I work with somebody.
This was also from Wisconsin. Yeah, I was just there.
I said, you know, we're playing Wisconsin for homecoming.
Yeah.
For you.
Well, I don't know, honestly, because I'm not saying anything. That's pretty good.